everyone, and welcome to this research seminar hosted by the British Centre for Literary Translation at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England. My name is Duncan Large, and I'm the BCLT's Executive Director. We're particularly pleased today to welcome a large number of our audience members in India. I recognize it's already 9:30 p.m. with you, so a special thanks to all those in alternative time zones for whom our start time may be a little less than ideal. At BCLT, we've had a long-standing connection with India. We have, for instance, been hosting a Charles Wallace India Trust Translating Fellow annually since 1996. And after Easter, we'll be hearing in this series from our current Charles Wallace Fellow, Divya Kalavala. Our speaker today, Mohini Gupta, is a Charles Wallace alumna, though of a different program. Mohini is currently a DPhil candidate in the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Oxford and Junior Dean at Mansfield College there. In 2017, she was the Charles Wallace India Trust Translator Writer Fellow at Aberystwyth University, hosted by Literature Across Frontiers. Mohini has recently co-edited Rethinking Education in the Context of Post-Pandemic South Asia, which appeared from Routledge last year, and The Hindu Bard, the poetry of Dorothy Banerjee from Hono Press, also last year. A graduate of SOAS, University of London, Mohini was a research fellow at Sarai, CSDS in Delhi, and a translator in residence at the Sangam House International Writers Residency in Bangalore. She's written on languages, literature, and translation for publications such as The Caravan magazine, Huffington Post, The Wire.in, Scroll.in, and the World Kidlit blog. Her English-Hindi translations have been published by Tulika Publishers. In July this year, Mohini will be leading a Hindi workshop at the Bristol Translates Summer School. Apologies if you registered for this talk at its original scheduled time last week on International Mother Language Day. Unfortunately, Mohini came down with COVID and we had to postpone her talk by a week, but thankfully she has recovered enough to be able to present today. You'll be aware that this event is being recorded and we'll be adding the recording to our BCLT YouTube channel shortly. As ever, I'm grateful to my BCLT colleagues Anna Good and Lily Alden for their technical assistance. Just before I hand over to Mohini, let me say that after her talk, we'll have time for a question session. We're using the Zoom webinar platform. That allows you then to submit questions via the Q&A button, as well as to upvote others' questions that you would particularly like to see answered. We also have the chat function enabled, so that's there for you by all means to use during the presentation. But if you would like to put a question to our speaker, then do please use the Q&A function. I'll then put any questions to Mohini at the end of the talk. But for now, it's my great pleasure to hand over to Mohini Gupta for a talk which is titled Language, Politics, Education and Translation in India. And there we have Mohini. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Professor Large. This is really a brilliant opportunity for me to present my research. And I'm so glad there's so many of you who've come here to attend this webinar and on a different date as well. So thank you so much for being here. Great. So the topic that I've chosen to sort of talk about today covers all of the sort of aspects of my life, my academic life and my life as a literary translator. So the title is Language, Politics, Education and Translation in India. And what I'll try to do in the next, say, 30 to 45 minutes is to really set the context of my research work, talk about my own position within my own research, where I come at it my motivations to choose this particular topic for my doctoral work, and give you a little bit of a flavor of the research that I'm conducting and the chapters that I'm writing currently. I'm still doing my PhD. I'm hoping to I'm sort of at the final stages, I'd like to say. But yeah, so I'll sort of share with you what I have at the moment. Um, just to give you a brief sort of introduction to my own journey, I've grown up in New Delhi in India, and I studied there until I finished my graduation in English literature. I then moved to London to do a master's in cultural studies. And my master's thesis sort of looked at language politics. So my preoccupation with questions around language and language politics started quite early on in my academic journey. Then I came back to New Delhi. I was working in Delhi in the education field for about 5 to 6 years. Um, and in the middle of this, I got the Charles Wallace India Trust Fellowship to pursue my own translation work for about 3 months. And I moved to Aberystwyth for that. Aberystwyth is a town in Wales in the United Kingdom. And that's really, in those 3 months that I spent in Aberystwyth in Wales, is really when I started thinking very deeply around my research topic. And I've always been interested in language politics, language hierarchies, post-colonialism, this sort of position of English versus Indian languages in India or in South Asia at large. But it was really when I spent some time in Wales that I learned a lot about the language politics in Wales, Welsh language politics, and how it's impacting education in the Welsh language. And that made me sort of want to investigate what's going on in the Indian language education model. So in my current research, I mainly look at the Indian language education model. So the language education policy in India, language textbooks, and language teaching practices. But I also have a small sort of case study, or a counterpoint, as I call it, of the Welsh education system as well. So I'll be presenting both of those things here today as well. And the academic discipline in which I situate my research has moved from English literature to cultural studies to social linguistics or linguistic anthropology, and I'll talk a bit more about that later on. I just want to start with my first sort of attempt at translation, because that's really where things started for me. When I was in school, I translated one poem called The Frog and the Nightingale. And if some of you have been following me and have ever heard me before, I've definitely talked about it. But this poem, The Frog and the Nightingale, which I will show later on as well, is taken from a poetry collection called Beastly Tales from Here and There by the really well-known Indian English writer Vikram Seth. These are a set of 10 long narrative animal fables in English, and I translated them into Hindi. In fact, this is a project that I was working on. I completed during my Charles Wallace India Trust Fellowship as well. But I started the journey very early on when I was 15 and in school, and I translated my first poem. And I think what I did in that translation without realizing is that I thought about all of these things later on, but I realized that the Hindi poems that I was reading in my school curriculum were not appealing to me in terms of, the rhyme, the musicality. The Hindi textbooks at the time contained a lot of patriotic poems, a lot of very preachy poems around, say, ethics or morals that children should follow, or things around how children should be obedient to their parents, listen to their teachers. So I remember thinking about a lot of these things in my Hindi classes, and there was this amazing poem in my English curriculum which I fell in love with, and I translated into Hindi. And when I translated it into Hindi, I used a particular kind of Hindi which seemed very relatable to someone of that age group. And it was a very colloquial kind of Hindi. It even included some Hinglish, which is a hybrid of Hindi and English, and some elements of sort of contemporary popular culture, things like that. And I realized that those are the kind of poems that I would have wanted to read as a 15-year-old or even as a younger reader. I've just given you a little bit of the translation of The Frog and the Nightingale. I'll read the first 4 lines. And it's a poem that sort of it's in rhymed verse throughout. So the first 4 lines go: once upon a time a frog croaked away in Bengal bog. Every night from dusk to dawn he croaked on and on and on. And in Hindi I've used the same rhyme scheme. So in Hindi it goes: दलदल देश में मेंढक एक करता रहता टर टर टेक, सूरज के ढलकर उगने तक टर टर चलती उसकी बकबक. So it's a similar kind of meter, similar kind of rhyme, and it sort of goes on. It's a very long poem. But really, what I wanted to show with this was that the idea was to translate poems into Hindi. In fact, this direction of translation was also a bit unusual for me, because the language that I'm more comfortable in expressing and writing in is English. But I choose to translate into Hindi because I think for me it's a way of sort of connecting with my own mother tongue as well. But also I am keen to sort of produce more poetry in a kind of language that I feel would appeal to young readers. And it is also for this reason that I, a few years ago, started this platform called Mother Tongue Twisters. I started just when the pandemic began in March 2020. And the idea was and is to create and curate Indian language poetry for young readers. We would run these sessions called Translation Thursdays every week. I think some of you who are here would be attending those as well. So I can see some familiar names. And we would invite translators. I mean, I would invite translators to talk about the craft and practice of translation. And we still sort of continue to create meaningful collaborations within this project. But the idea, again, was to have an archive of poems that would be contemporary and relatable for young readers in the country. And of course, my language ability is limited, but I've sort of involved many of my friends and poets and translators to contribute poems in their languages as well. Sorry. Yeah. So really, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I am very much a product of the same language and education politics that I am studying in my research currently. And I have, of course, experienced firsthand the sort of impact of Hindi language textbooks or teaching practices in the classroom. And what happens when the content of these textbooks is not contemporary or relevant, especially at the primary school level. And personally, I feel that poetry is a very important tool to create a kind of positive connection with the languages that you're studying. And like I said, my translation work has always been sort of geared towards creating that connection as well. And I'll sort of now move into talking about my research. And that research now is trying to understand these connections between the education system and language attitudes, and really go back to primary school and see where do we really start developing our attitudes towards the languages that we speak, and how impactful is education policy, language textbooks, and teaching practices on sort of developing these attitudes. I also wanted to just bring in this short poem that I had written for Tulika Books, which is called Rhyming Rolling Rice. And it's one of the first children's poems that I wrote in English to begin with. I've now started writing more children's poetry in Hindi as well. But this poem in particular was, it's about a particular experience that children have, where when their sort of parents are feeding them rice, they feed them they encourage them to eat those balls of rice, taking names of like particular family members. So it says, I won't eat, I won't eat. I tell her so many times. She smiles and with her magic hands rolls the rice into rhymes. This little bite for Dada Dadi, that little one for Chachu, one more bite for Papa Mummy, and the best last bite for you. And when I wrote this poem and shared it, when it was published by Tulika, I got a lot of responses on how relatable it was and how they'd never really seen this experience, documented. And I think that was one of the other reasons. And I wrote this very early on, and I think this sort of again motivated me to do more work in this field as well. So moving on to my doctoral research currently, like I said, the idea is to go back to school and understand where the sort of urban youth in India, and I'm focusing on the urban context, because in India it's very difficult to generalize across the country. It's almost impossible to even generalize within one city of New Delhi, which is the city that I work on. But yeah, I'm looking at a very urban context, and I'm looking at how the urban youth in India forms their attitudes towards their languages, so language attitudes, and how they're impacted by language policy, curriculum, and teaching practices. The one lens that I'm looking at all of this through is the lens of postcolonial shame. And I'll discuss this concept in detail, but the idea is to understand at what point this idea of shame gets attached to the mother tongue in school, and sort of how these ideologies get reproduced in education systems. So I just want to provide like an overview of the sort of linguistic landscape, and also give an overview of the theories and the academic theories that I'm working with for my research. This may be repetitive for some of you who are already familiar with this, but in case you're not, there are thousands and thousands of languages in India. It's a very, very complex multilingual context. There are only 22 languages that are recognized by the Constitution of India. But if you look at the census data from 2011, we don't have the latest census data yet, but from 2011, there were 121 languages. There were 270 mother tongues, which is categorized as a language that's spoken by more than 10,000 people. There were 1,369 what are called rationalized mother tongues, and more than 19,500 unrecognized mother tongues. So if you look at the raw data, there's actually almost 20,000 different kinds of languages. Of course, they're not classified as languages, and that's a whole other politics in itself in terms of what is classified as a language, what is classified as a dialect, and so on. And in fact, there are two official languages mentioned in the Constitution, which are English and Hindi. And there's a constant sort of battle between some sort of governments pushing for a national language, and that language is always proposed to be Hindi. But there's a lot of backlash from other linguistic groups who believe that other languages are as sort of as deserving of being a national language as Hindi is. So there's that constant struggle going on, and language politics in that sense is a very, very active sort of space. It's these debates and discussions are still going on in a very, very in a very active way. So like I said, it's something that's extremely relevant until today, this language question in India. We know that language and politics are intricately woven. There have been so many language movements which are so closely linked with identity. Language, of course, is a very important part of your identity. And I think when I went to Wales and spent time in Wales, that's what I really discovered the politics there, the language politics there, and how much it matters that the loss of identity with the loss of language, and how much that motivated their own efforts to revitalize the language. And of course, in the South Asian context, it's as important and as crucial. The term that I use for my research is language ideologies. So all of these issues around language and identity, language and politics, language and post-colonialism, language and class, caste, gender, all of these sort of issues related to language come under the broader umbrella term of language ideologies, which I'll be using. Like I said, I've drawn some of my research terms and methods from the sociolinguistics space. So I've already explained language ideologies and the sort of terms that I'm going to be covering. The methods that I use for my research are mainly of three types. These are borrowed from linguistic anthropology. So one is I analyze documents, so I analyze policy documents and language textbooks. The second is qualitative interviews with language teachers and language policy makers. And the third kind of data that I have is classroom observations. So I spent time in various schools in New Delhi in India, and I observed classroom teaching of Hindi mostly, but also some other languages that were being taught in those schools. I was a non-participant observer in these schools, and Yeah, so I've included all of these three kinds of data in my research, and those are the methods that I'm using. My field site, like I mentioned, is mostly New Delhi. And the schools that I covered in New Delhi were a mix of private schools and government schools, and a mix of English medium schools, which is basically schools that use English as a language of instruction, and Hindi medium schools. So it was a mix of different permutations and combinations of these four things. And I tried to get some, it's very difficult to get representative samples. Like I said, in New Delhi, I found that even generalizing between two schools of the same neighborhood in New Delhi was very hard. So that's been a big struggle during my research, but anyway, that's what my data looks like. And like I said, I have a comparative case study with Wales, where I compare some of the policy documents and textbooks in Hindi with, policy documents in India and language textbooks in Hindi with language policy documents and textbooks in Wales. Yeah, so I have sort of briefly explained language ideology. I've just put down some definitions. It's a set of beliefs in terms of which people rationalize the use of particular linguistic forms to achieve certain socially understood purposes to be used in certain socially understood contexts. It's a very it's a bit of a convoluted way to say it, but this is the first time language ideology as a term was kind of established by Michael Silverstein. As you can imagine, it sort of bridges the study of language and study of social theory. And like I said, the idea is that this project looks at the reproduction of these language ideologies and hierarchies using educational institutes as the site of reproduction. Of course, my ultimate aim is to understand how this nexus of policy, curriculum, and teaching practices impacts attitudes of young people towards their languages. So what I'll do now is just give you a slice of my research. And what I want to elaborate upon is my chapter on the evolution of postcolonial shame through language policy. So like I said, I have three kinds of data. So this is a document analysis that I've done of policy documents in India and in Wales. And my the lens that I'm looking at policy documents through is the lens of postcolonial shame, and how the sense of shame has been very officially sort of documented over the years through these policies. I wanted to start with this poem. I don't speak French, but it's a poem that means hiccup. And it's loosely translated as the poem is sort of in the voice of a mother speaking to her son. And she says, "Shut up, I told you, you must speak French, the French of France, the Frenchman's French, French. This sort of for me, since I'm looking at sort of post-colonial shame and language, I just wanted to start with this poem, which kind of talks about, this preoccupation with speaking the right kind of French or English, and this sort of internalized hierarchy of languages that we pass on in post-colonial contexts. The term postcolonial shame I have taken from Timothy Bewes and his book that came out in 2010 called The Event of Postcolonial Shame. In this book, he mainly sort of analyzes literatures that come from postcolonial contexts, and he looks at the sort of idea of shame in these literatures. But what I do is sort of apply this concept of post-colonial shame to mother tongue education and how and languages, and how this sense of shame is sort of reproduced in schools through policy, curriculum, and teaching practices. I have always really benefited from reading the scholar Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who's written this book called Decolonizing the Mind, amongst many other of his writings. He talks about controlling a people's culture by controlling their tools of self-definition in relationship to others. In fact, one of the examples that he gives is of Sidney Poitier and him going back to Africa, and him saying in his autobiography that he grew up reading so much about he grew up reading so much about snakes in African countries that even now, when he goes back to Africa, even if he's staying in a metropolitan city in a fancy hotel, he starts associating the place that he is from with snakes, because he has grown up with these images in his mind, and that has had such a deep impact that he's internalized this certain kind of stereotyping about his own culture because of the literature that he's been exposed to. Gugi wa Thiong'o talks about the domination of people's language by the language of the colonizing nations, which was crucial to the domination of the mental universe of the colonized. The idea is, of course, that language was a very important aspect of control and a very important tool of control, and it continues to be that in sort of most post-colonial contexts until today. Like I said, this chapter sort of applies this concept of post-colonial shame to languages and analyzes policy documents. I also want to say that this concept of shame is sort of under-theorized in the South Asian context. There is not that much literature on shame in particular. There is literature on guilt. There is some literature on humiliation, and shame sort of get subsumed under those broader topics. But of course, there's a lot of nuanced differences between these emotions. So this anyway, I've explained what this chapter looks at, so I'll just get into the policy documents that I start with. So the first very obvious document that I begin with is I say obvious because anyone who's sort of grown up in the region or worked in the space would know about this, is the 1835 Minute on Education that was written up by the British colonial officer Thomas B. Macaulay. It's called Macaulay's Minute. Just to set the context for this particular document, Macaulay came in at a time where we know that there was sort of an Orientalism going on in the British during the British rule in India, where British officials were sort of learning the languages of the region, translating documents, translating ancient texts. So there was a sort of interest in the literature of the region, but at the same time, there was a little bit of a patronizing attitude in terms of feeling that the people of the region will not be able to either appreciate or understand literature, say in English, and also this sense of keeping, not exposing them to ideas of like rebellion, or like ideas and connecting them with the rest of the world. So there were all of these ideas that went into this sort of Orientalist attitude towards ruling India. But then in the early 1800s, there were a lot of Anglicists who were quite clear that English was the only way to morally and intellectually uplift the masses, in their words. And there was a sort of, there was an attempt to kind of create more and more schools and just institutions where English could be taught. And the idea, I mean, the aim, of course, was to always form, and I'm reading from the document, to form a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes, morals, and in intellect. So the idea was to really create a group of people to serve the British officials. That was always the aim with which English language education was introduced by the British in India. And this particular document that was released in 1835, for the first time, formalized this kind of widespread establishment of English language schools in India. And the vocabulary and the language that it uses in the document, talks about the sort of intrinsic superiority of the English language. There is the very infamous line where he claims that a single shelf of a good European library is worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. Says that English is better worth knowing than Sanskrit or Arabic for the intellectual improvement of people. Also talks about how there is no substantial scientific or literary information present in the dialects spoken by the natives. There's another line which says, Indian texts contain medical doctrines which would disgrace an English farrier, astronomy which would move laughter in girls at an English boarding school, history abounding with kings 30 feet high and reigns 30,000 years long, and geography made of seas of treacle and seas of butter. So there's a kind of ridiculing of the languages themselves or whatever's been written in the languages in the region, and a clear sort of hierarchy being set up between English and Indian languages. So this was I think the first document that really put like documented this kind of hierarchy, and it sort of continued in that way, and it did lead to a lot more sort of English language education being set up. This document also recommended the shutting down of certain schools that and colleges that taught or that sort of prioritized Indian languages and taught in the languages. I'm just going to move on. That's a picture of Thomas Macaulay. I want to sort of go to Wales at this point and just talk about a very similar document that came out in 1847. So just 12 years after the Macaulay's Minute in India. This was a report which has come to be known in popular sort of imagination. It's called the Treason of the Blue Books. Blue Books because British official documents had a blue cover at the time. This report has a very long name. I think it is the Report of the Commissioners of Inquiry into the State of Education in Wales. It was commissioned by a certain Welsh member of parliament who was clear in his belief that the country's native tongue was an inherent drawback to its future progress. So what this report did was really it sent 3 English officials who, first of all, did not speak Welsh into Welsh-speaking areas to assess and evaluate the quality of education in these regions. And these 3 officials came back saying that because of them speaking the Welsh language, the quality of education is really low. They don't understand English, and there was also sort of a lot of value judgment on drinking habits of people in Wales or levels of cleanliness and hygiene. These are quotes from the report that say, in their habits, the labor classes are particularly dirty, and the universally unchaste nature of the women in Wales. It talks about how the language keeps the Welsh people in a state of poverty, immorality, and degradation. It calls the Welsh language a language of old-fashioned agriculture, of theology, and of simple rustic life, while all the world about the Welshman is English. So some very sort of similar kind of vocabulary used in terms of saying that these languages don't contain contemporary or relevant or scientific practical information that's useful in life every day. Like I said, there's a lot of commentary on like cleanliness and drinking and decency and other sort of value judgments. So they were very sort of, I found it really interesting how similar these 2 documents were in their vocabulary around setting up this hierarchy, and also how closely in time these came out as well. I just wanted to spend a little bit of time explaining why I also chose to compare India to Wales, because I get this question a lot. It's not a comparison that's been drawn very much before, and there are also some problems with it. The most obvious one being that Wales was very much a part of the colonizing project in India as well. So I'm comparing both of them as sort of post-colonial context in some sense, but there are some sort of complexities within that. But Wales has been called the first colony of the British Empire. What I'm really doing is comparing the shame that got attached to the languages in these regions. So those are the that's the main thing that I'm comparing in these 2 regions. And also sort of looking at the similar timelines of the documentation of these policies and language and education policies, and how this struggle against English as an oppressor language in these regions, how that struggle has kind of evolved over the years. And so, this particular section that I've been describing looks at the 1800s, but I also come to sort of current policy documents and contemporary contemporary documents and looking at how they have evolved over the years and what they say about language today. Um, I said that there's not been that much written about the comparison between the Indian and Welsh language question, but I did find something from 1836 where one of the colonial officers called Charles Watkin Williams Wynne, who originally belonged to Wales, he said this was when the sort of whole debate around introducing English into India was going on. He said, as to the introduction of the English language into the East, this attempt at forcing the natives to adopt it would, in his opinion, produce a complete reaction and defeat the plan. When he considered how attached the people of India were to their own language, it was not probable, out of compliment to their rulers, they would all at once adopt another. A striking example of the truth in his observation might be found in the case of his own country, Wales. So there have been reports which talk about how he believes that this project of introducing English language education into India would not work because he had seen the reaction to it in his own country, Wales. So there was that comparison, a very, very remote kind of a comparison that was drawn in 1836. There was also Gandhi, who in one of his speeches in 1909 said that Mr. Lloyd George is taking steps to ensure that Welsh children do not forget their language. How much more need is there for Indians to preserve their language than for the Welsh to preserve theirs, and how much more keen should we be? So there has been some sort of some kind of a comparison drawn between this struggle against English, the struggle to remain relevant against English. And of course, the other big reason for drawing this comparison was because when I spent time in Wales, I learned the language, and I wanted to use that ability to kind of read some of their policy documents, whereas those are mostly in English, but also their textbooks for children. And that's when it really came in handy. And I wanted to sort of draw this comparison between the two using that. So I've given a sense of sort of historical policy, and I wanted to sort of make a very, very big jump to contemporary times. And the impact, of course, language planning has a huge impact on planning society. And the way that things are documented in a policy document, whether it's language policy or education policy, has a huge impact on the ways in which these things are thought about in society. So whether it's the prioritizing of certain languages over others, all of those things impact the world outside as well. And a huge part of language planning is related to education. So, there's always, in India, we're still struggling with this question around the medium of education in schools. There are so many reports that state that children learn better in their mother tongues. It's an issue that's constantly a central point in every national education policy, in every national curriculum framework in the country, even till today. The latest education policy came out in 2020, and there is a huge section on mother tongue education and how to approach multilingualism. The national curriculum framework is being drafted as we speak, but the most recent version came out in December 2023, so only a couple of months ago, and that also has like a long discussion around multilingualism in education. So language and education planning sort of go hand in hand in that sense, and this project is sort of trying to understand that the connection between the two as well. I talked about the new education policy that came out in 2020. So actually, this policy came out after I had applied for my PhD. I sent in my application in 2019 when the previous education policy had only come out many, many years ago. And when I started my PhD just a month before that was when this policy came out. So it has become a huge part of my research by default. And it says a lot of the things that sound great on paper. So there's a strong emphasis on the power of multilingualism in education. The policy encourages mother tongue education at least until class 5 and even beyond that, wherever possible. There's a 3-language formula in India that was introduced in 1968, which basically states that every school needs to teach 3 languages. So English, Hindi, and the regional language of the state. So this three-language formula is is sort of encouraged to be continued in schools. There's a huge emphasis on India's classical languages. So Sanskrit sort of gets a disproportionate amount of attention in these documents. And in fact, I found really interesting that in the policy document of 2020, there was almost a direct response to Macaulay's 1835 minute, where Macaulay had said that a single shelf of a European library is greater than the literature written in Sanskrit and Arabic. There's a line in the latest policy that says Sanskrit possesses a classical literature greater in volume than that of Latin and Greek put together. So I don't know if it's meant to be a reaction to it, but it's almost like a direct sort of reaction. It seems like a direct comment on that particular statement of Macaulay's minute. So really, what I wanted to say was that the kind of shame or trauma and the hierarchies that were set up in, say, the early 1800s still continue to have that impact on language and education policy today. And in fact, um, it sort of almost pushes current policies to be sometimes even more regressive, and sort of going back to a in this attempt to go back to a golden past. There's a lot of other things that are glossed over. But anyway, I'm not going to get into that right now. I'm just going to stick to this, and then if we have time later in the discussion and the question answers, we can talk a little bit about what's happening with that now in the current politics. But coming back to this policy in 2020, the main purpose is, as they say, a preservation and promotion of India's cultural wealth. And like I was saying, that I think it's, the current government is almost having a reaction to some of these. There's a huge sort of drive to decolonize, and mother tongue education is a big part of that as well. What I also want to, before I end, just wrap up with showing you a little bit of the curriculum as it exists today. So this policy that I'm describing now has only come out now. The new textbooks based on this policy are not out yet. So the textbooks that I am currently analyzing are based on a previous policy and previous national curriculum framework. But what I wanted to say was that why I feel language education is so important to study is because we know that language is a great force of socialization, as it's been called. And there's this idea of language socialization that has become a huge part of my project, where young people in the classroom are socialized simultaneously into and through language. So while children are learning the language in the classroom, there's also a lot more going on in language education, which is socializing them into a certain idea of, say, the nation, of socio-cultural values around them. So language education becomes a very potent tool for, say, bringing in different political agendas, or it becomes a really important space to convey some of these ideas that, say, the government wants to pass on around the nation, or around around the nation. So language education, I feel, is a very sort of ripe space, because linguistic development, like I've said, goes hand in hand with socio-cultural development. And childhood, as I've sort of used the sociologist Christopher Jenk's term of childhood as a period of structured becoming, which is a time when individuals are very impressionable through the content that they're reading in educational institutions. And in India in particular, textbooks are considered as the final word for anything. It's the printed word is given a lot of value in the classroom, and even though it's sort of considered as a kind of final word, or an objective space, it actually is a very political space as well. So like I said, it's through the material that's selected for language textbooks, or for any textbooks really, and the knowledge that becomes legitimized through it, that students start forming their worldview towards and through the languages that they learn. So some of the questions that I ask, and I won't have time to get into, of course, today, some of the questions that I'm really asking is, some of the questions that I'm asking are, if Hindi textbooks today are teaching the language or teaching a lot more than language, and what are the kind of political and ideological motivations behind creating the language textbook as it exists right now. In fact, in the last 4 years that I've been conducting my research, textbooks have been changing every 6 months, and this is not a normal occurrence. It's happening because after the pandemic, the curriculum sort of the body that creates national textbooks, they've come up with a rationalization process to deal with learning disruptions in the pandemic. So because of that, they've reduced the textbook a lot more. And what's happening is that in that process of reduction, there are some sort of insidious things going on in terms of what is being erased and what is being left in these textbooks through this rationalization process. So even though textbooks change every few years, in the last 4 years, they've changed at least 3 or 4 times because of this new rationalization process. So these are some of the politics that I'm looking at in terms of the textbooks. I will wrap up in the next few minutes. I just want to show you like a brief comparison of the Hindi textbook and the Welsh textbook, where I just want to broadly talk about the content and the content that's selected for language textbooks. So in India, I noticed that there's a lot of focus on unity and diversity, for instance, or a lot of chapters on freedom fighters, talking about the sort of greatness of the nation, or sort of instilling patriotism through the chapters that are selected for Hindi language textbooks. In fact, in Hindi textbooks, this occurs more than other language textbooks, especially the English language textbook. And there's also a lot of, like I mentioned very early on in the talk, a lot of sort of focus on good behavior, morality, some of these sort of preachy chapters around how children should behave with their parents, with their teachers. And more than that, the other thing that I thought was very glaring was the accessibility of the language in Hindi textbooks. So at a very primary level, say class 3 or class 4 or class 5, even those textbooks include chapters in very old forms of Hindi, classical Hindi, which would not at all be familiar to students who are at that age. So it's I found the sort of age appropriateness of the textbook very odd, and why I use the Welsh textbooks as a foil almost to this is because if you look at the Welsh textbooks of the same level or of the same sort of years, first of all, there are no centralized textbooks in Wales. Students are sort of on a learning continuum in their classrooms, and classrooms are sort of much smaller also than, say, an Indian classroom, but it's a lot more sort of customized. The teaching process is a lot more customized based on students' individual capacities and progress. But what I noticed was that there's a lot of focus on the visual in the textbook, in the Welsh language textbooks as compared to Hindi language textbooks. There's very little, very small illustrations in Hindi textbook as compared to the Welsh textbook, which have about 80% of the page would be illustrations. There are no question answers at the end of every chapter. The themes and objects that you find in the Welsh language textbooks are, say, things like pirates and dragons and familiar events like birthday parties or family members or pets. There's a magic key that children are discovering in these stories. So it's a lot more story based. It's a lot more to do with everyday familiar themes and issues, or like fantasies, as compared to, like I said, the Hindi textbooks, which I found there's a lot more sort of going on in terms of what is included in these textbooks. So I just wanted to draw that comparison briefly and say that, coming back to my first point around why I even chose to study this issue of language education, was because of my own experience of studying in this education system and feeling that textbooks sort of need to highlight more contemporary and relatable themes, and also be in a more accessible language, which will then create a more positive connection of the children towards the language, or a more positive relationship, because it also the content and the accessibility of the content also serves to then alienate the reader or alienate the student who's studying that textbook. And that's really sort of that's really the reason why I'm interested in studying some of these issues, and looking at language policy, language textbooks, and language teaching practices. Teaching practices is a whole other sort of arena that I'm not covering in this talk today, because it's also a chapter that I'm still writing, so it's not complete. But I hope to sort of create this this sort of correlation between how language is being documented at the policy curriculum level, how it's being taught in the classroom, and what kind of an impact that's having on the students who are studying the language in schools right now. So I'll actually stop with that now, and let me stop the share. Thank you so much for listening. I really hope it made some sense. I tried to bring in different elements and kind of bring in different aspects of the research, but I hope that it made some sense.
Very much so. Thank you so much, Mohini. That's a really lovely presentation, and plenty to respond to in that. So can I at this point invite our audience, please, to put any questions that you might have into the Q&A, and I'll put them then to Mohini on your behalf. Let's start though. I was thank you for giving us the kind of the full picture and the story of how this topic and this comparison came about. I was interested. I mean, for those perhaps who are not familiar with the Charles Wallace India Trust fellowship schemes, I believe the Aberystwyth fellowship is the only translator stroke writer fellowship, isn't it? Our scheme is for a translator, and so I can understand then why you might have been particularly attracted to apply for that scheme. I'm wondering whether you sensed in advance that there might be some kinds of similarity in Wales around language policy, or whether it all kind of it all just hit you when you arrived and you thought and everything else followed then.
Yeah, I'm very ashamed to say that I was extremely ignorant of the of Welsh language politics before I got there. And I applied because, like you said, it's one of the unique sort of fellowships that combine translation and creative writing. And by that time, I had already sort of developed this desire to write in Hindi and write for children in Hindi. So while I had this poetry collection to complete in terms of translating the beastly tales from here and there, I had that project to complete, but I also wanted to start writing in Hindi for the first time for children. So I used the fellowship space to kind of do that, where I completed the translation, I started writing in Hindi, and I also developed the Mother Tongue Twisters project while I was there. So my own writing sort of made me then reach out to other friends and poets who I invited to sort of write for this platform, and then we all kind of put our writings together on Mother Tongue Twisters, and it's still a developing kind of a project at the moment. So that was really it. That was the reason that I went there for. But the minute I got there, and really it was from the first evening that I got there, because I arrived in Aberystwyth, which is one of the most sort of politically Welsh-speaking towns. It's been the hub of the Welsh language movement since the 60s or so, or maybe even before that. But I was living in a Welsh-speaking house. I was living with a family that was Welsh-speaking. I was seeing road signs everywhere. I was hearing it on the streets. So I enjoy learning languages. So I just started picking it up slowly. I joined some apps which were teaching Welsh. I joined some classes as well. And I realized while I was learning, while I was talking to people, and I think once you learn the language, people also kind of open up to you a little more and kind of welcome you into their world. And I think people were really sort of, they had a lot of very interesting conversations with me around language politics in Wales. And then I got a chance to visit the first Welsh medium school, which is in Aberystwyth, called Ysgol Gymraeg. They invited me for a talk there. The talk was just on India. It was, with year 6 students. But then when I went to visit the school, I started talking to the headmaster and the head teacher and the other teachers, and they started telling me about what they're doing to get students excited about the Welsh language. And then I learned about the past sort of trauma. There was this Welsh knot in schools. I don't know how familiar you are with the system of Welsh knot, but there was a time where in schools, if you were caught speaking Welsh, you had to hang a piece of wood around your neck which said Welsh not, and at the end of the day you were punished, if you were caught speaking Welsh. So there were all of these tools of kind of humiliation and shame that was set up in the education system, informally obviously, but they were very much there. And there's a whole generation that's had to move past that shame to to today, where the government and the schools are really encouraging the newer generation to speak the language. So I found some of those things really interesting, and I started doing more research, and that made me think about what's going on in India in terms of language learning at the primary level. How what are the tools that teachers are using, for instance, in classrooms to to sort of create this sort of positive kind of an attitude towards the language, towards the mother tongues. So these are some of the things that happened. I think it wasn't at all planned, and it just it was a really wonderful coincidence. Yeah.
Excellent. Yes, I mean, I'd heard about the Welsh knot. Wasn't the idea that you'd kind of, it would get passed on during the day to anyone who was caught speaking Welsh, and then the person who had it around their neck at the end of the day is the one that would get punished. Dreadful.
Yeah. In fact, it was very interesting because when I was interviewing my some of my respondents for my research, one of the respondents who was actually around my age, so this was only say like 15 or so years ago, when he was in school, he said that he went through a similar, and I didn't even tell him about Welsh Not. He was just telling me his experience, and he said that in a school in North Delhi, there was a system that if they were caught speaking Hindi, they were not just sort of humiliated in public, they were also misgendered. So if it was a girl, there would be a mustache drawn on her. If it was a boy, they were made to wear bangles and a bindi, which is like a thing on the forehead that women wear. So they'd also be misgendered and then paraded around school at the end of the day, because they'd been caught speaking Hindi. So I found that extremely, I mean, it's quite violent at so many levels, not just the linguistic level, but also this kind of, gender sort of complexities that are being set up, gender binaries that are being set up. So, so very similar kind of practices in some schools in India as well.
I wonder, hearing you talk about these matters sent me back to actually my own experience teaching English in Austria, in schools in Austria, where certainly at the time there was a very strict prohibition on using Austrian dialect in the school, and it had to be standard German. And there was one teacher I remember who was the darling of the kids, because occasionally he would use dialect phrases, and it was all very kind of hush hush, and he could have got into trouble for that. And my question to you then, thinking about that experience, that was dialect, that was Austrian dialect versus standard German. So it's a rather different sort of dynamic, perhaps, to the question that you're interested in, and the relation between a hegemonic, a colonial language, at least initially, English, and other Indian languages. And so I'm wondering whether the kind of power dynamic that you're looking at, whether it is a more generalizable then, and it applies to any kind of sort of the differences between any kind of prestige language, whether it be a colonial language or a standard version of a national language, versus then other kinds of language which, for whatever reason, are viewed as inferior. I wonder whether your model can be kind of rolled out to include examples like that.
I'm actually really glad you brought this up, because the one thing that I couldn't really problematize in my presentation is that Hindi as a language is considered quite hegemonic in itself within the internal sort of language politics of India. And I've chosen to focus on Hindi solely because I have myself grown up in New Delhi, and it's the only language that I speak and understand, the only Indian language apart from English. I mean, if it's an Indian language. Anyway, but it's I've chosen to focus on Hindi, but it's very difficult to portray Hindi as representative of other Indian languages as well, because even though socially and economically it may lose out to English, politically, especially right now, it's being pushed as the national language, for instance. It's being used to kind of convey certain ideas of like a majoritarian politics. In the census, I mentioned the census, and if you look at the census, you'll find that Hindi seems to be the most widely spoken language, especially in the north of India. But if you start looking at the details, Hindi is actually just an umbrella term used for so many other dialects that are not recognized as languages. So there is that politics as well. So I'm trying to, in my research, kind of look at this dual position of Hindi, because it's very hard to avoid that, especially in the current moment, in the current political moment. So I am looking at the dual position where Hindi is in a certain position as compared to English, but then has a very different relationship with other Indian dialects and languages as well. So it absolutely, there are very similar things that go on in the Hindi classroom when it comes to non-standard forms of Hindi or other dialects that are considered to be inferior, say, to standard Hindi. So those things also go on at the same time. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I was wondering about the status of Hindi, and you've absolutely preempted that question. But we have perhaps take a first question from one of our audience members, who says, this is Achit. Excellent presentation. The modern Hindi, Kariboli, is also a very new language with perhaps a history of 200 years. Hindi is a modern language that claims a long history. How do we accommodate the long history of Hindi for school children? What would be your ideal curriculum for Hindi textbooks for kids?
Wow.
So there you go. I suppose if you were making the language policy, how would you do things differently?
Okay, this is a question I was not prepared for because there's a long list of things that I'd like to include in my dream Hindi curriculum. But you're right that modern Hindi is a very new language. In fact, the Hindi as we speak it today is maybe only about 120, 130 years old, and not more than that. And there were so many different forms of Hindi before. There was Hindustani, uh, or Khadi Boli, Awadhi, Braj, and then sort of all these older sort of forms of Hindi. In fact, these languages have now been called as dialects of Hindi, whereas they are sort of predecessors of Hindi, of modern Hindi as we know it today. I think my issue is with the number of classical Hindi texts that are included in the current textbook, and especially at the level at which they come in, and also because I've sort of looked at the way they're being taught in schools. It's I think there is a real issue with the accessibility of the textbook as it exists today, and because of my interest in poetry, and I think because of the research that exists on how poetry connects to young readers, I would love for there to be more contemporary and relatable poems in the Hindi textbook. And I think, and this issue was brought up by one of the teachers that I was interviewing, and she was saying there's a lot of, maybe not a lot, but um, there are literary texts that exist for very, very young children, and then and then for adults. But the sort of young adult section of the population, there is a huge sort of lack in terms of like interesting, appealing texts that exist for that kind of age group. So I think what happens is the texts that are picked for those age groups in the textbooks become extremely age inappropriate. So either they're too, the level is too high, and that's what a lot of school teachers also complained about, is that some of the people who are writing these textbooks are higher educational professionals or university professors, and they are writing school textbooks without considering how it would actually impact the classroom, and how difficult it would be for teachers to teach those texts. Like a class 5 or class 6 Hindi textbook contains these sort of chapters or these short stories which are written in very, very Sanskritized Hindi, which would again sort of serve to kind of alienate the reader. There's a lot of I also sort of asked some of the more sort of difficult questions around how there's a lot of even though there's this focus on unity and diversity, there's a kind of token focus on um, representing the diversity of India from around the country. At the same time, when it comes to religion, you'll see a lot of sort of a lot of Hindu imagery, a lot of Hindu kind of texts from Hindu scriptures that have been taken, and there is like an abundance of those in some Hindi textbooks as well. So I find that, yeah, I find that this commitment to unity and diversity is a little bit tokenistic, and it needs to be pushed a little bit more. Um, but yeah, I'll stop there. I don't know if I've really answered your question, but yeah, I do think there's a lot that needs to change, and I think it can start by at least drawing in the readers with sort of themes that are more relatable and familiar to their age group.
Is this also a translation issue then? Because you started off showing us one of your translations, and telling us that you were kind of motivated to do it, partly at least because you were dissatisfied with the translated literature that was available. I mean, just following on from the point you were just making, then, are any of the Hindi poems, are they translated from other languages? Or are they all originally in Hindi? And perhaps more generally, would you say that there's actually an issue for translation into Hindi, that it needs to be more relatable, as you were saying? It needs perhaps to be a kind of a freer translation form. Is there, I mean, can one generalize about translation into Hindi, particularly for children, perhaps in that way?
Yeah. I think the poems that exist in the Hindi textbooks are all mostly original. I could be wrong, but at least all the ones that I've read, there are some chapters that are translated from other languages. So it could be from English, or there are some short stories from Russian, for instance, that are translated into Hindi, Urdu into Hindi. So there are some translations that exist in the textbook, but not when it comes to poetry. The poetry that I've seen has always been original.
Hmm.
Again, so it's either contemporary Hindi or it's classical Hindi. So the 15th century, 16th century poets. There's a lot of those poets that come into the Hindi textbook. Sorry, I've forgotten the main question that you asked me.
Um, oh well.
Were you saying that is there a space for sort of more translated literature?
Yes, I mean, about it, is it possible to generalize about a sort of a standard style of translating into Hindi, which is perhaps not so approachable and perhaps needs freshening up? And is there a kind of a norm, a translation norm, which needs kind of addressing or breaking with?
Yeah, so again, I haven't seen that many translations that are part of the textbook, but I think I would love to make a case for it because I do think there's a lot of really exciting poetry from around the world that can be brought into Hindi. And because it's very rare to find, say, rhymed poems translated into rhymed poems in Hindi. And I think that's one of the big decisions I took, is to translate, because I think the appeal of some of these poems for young readers is in the kind of musicality and the rhyme of it. And if that's not replicated, then it kind of loses the fun. And I think that's obviously very hard to do. So I don't think so many of those translations exist. But yeah, I think I would like to make a case for those, because it can bring in so many exciting things into the Hindi language, and I hope that the other people will also be kind of encouraged to do that. But I don't want to sort of say that that kind of literature doesn't exist. But I'm only talking about what I was exposed to through the textbooks in the classrooms, and that's what really, yeah, motivated me.
Good. Let's we have one comment from an anonymous attendee who congratulates you and says this is really interesting. How can we get in touch? Well, I think the answer to that is do simply look Mohini up, Mohini Gupta in Oxford and at Mansfield College, and you'll find Mohini's contact details there. Also, our anonymous attendee asked, would we be able to find this online? And the answer is yes, indeed. Shortly after we finished today, the recording will be made available on the BCLT YouTube channel. So you'll be able to catch up if there were any parts that you missed or would like to enjoy again, or to share with others. And that will be on our BCLT YouTube channel. A question now from Rosalind Harvey. Hi, Ros. Ros says, thanks, Mohini. So interesting. Do you know of any non-academic or more accessible texts on post-colonial shame as connected to language? Thank you.
Thank you, Rosalind, for that question. Thank you for being here. I'm trying to think. I've mostly read up academic texts. I think that Guki Wathiongo's Decolonizing the Mind is actually not very densely academic. I think it's quite an easy read, actually. And it's a really great, it's from 1987. So, of course, there's been a lot of time that's passed since, and it may or may not be as relevant today, but I think it's very relevant. And I think that he explains some of these this kind of dissonance that children face when they study in a certain language in school, and when they are and the linguistic universe of their home, and that kind of dissonance that gets created, and what that kind of creates in their mind, and how just the impact of that on students. I think that kind of language hierarchy and the language shame that they internalize through the school is really beautifully kind of portrayed in this textbook. That's the only one that's come to my mind right now, but I'm sure there are more, and I'll sort of think about it and also maybe get back, if that's okay.
I had a question for you, Mohini, about the situation in India, particularly relating to translation then, and your notion of post-colonial shame then, because as you were presenting it then, the impact of post-colonial shame is to prevent the use of an Indian language, so that schooling is through the medium of English, and those who are being educated are made to feel shame if they don't use English, and so on. It seems to me that almost kind of militates against any kind of translation. It's the erasure of the Indian language, but it's also the erasure potentially of translation itself, if you're if the ideological aim is to sort of erase the Indian identity and to create only an English identity in that case. So I'm wondering whether in that circumstance then translation becomes kind of subversive in itself. If you're looking to kind of bridge between the two languages, that's kind of giving a validation to both, whichever direction you're translating between. I wonder, I mean, does that sound right? Is there other examples that you would say of translation as a kind of subversive practice? Or, because I'm thinking as well about directions of translation, and historically which directions translations have moved in, and whether those directions are also changing now in shall we say post-colonial India.
So I'll try to answer the question to the best of my
ability. There were several questions.
Yeah, I'll try to cover as much as possible, but I don't know if it'll be comprehensive. But I do think there was a time where that was the case, where translated literature translations were really extremely marginalized within the publishing space, within the sort of book market. And in fact, we've had Indian English writers feel a certain kind of superiority over Indian language writers as well. There's a famous statement by Salman Rushdie where he talks about the only worthy literature coming from India being in Indian English. So there were some of these attitudes at some point. I think we've moved past that, and I think the last 10 years definitely have seen a huge shift in that mindset. And I think just like I was showing in the new education policy, for instance, this kind of new focus on mother tongue education, on the benefits of multilingualism, seeing the advantages of that. I think some of those things are coming into the literary world as well, or maybe they were already there, but it's sort of so translation as subversion, I would say, maybe it was more subversive a couple of, like, maybe a decade and a half or 2 decades ago, but I think now it's become quite different. And at least translations from Indian languages into English are sort of moving into the mainstream slowly. I think there is, like, the ecosystem is kind of become much more conducive to it, in terms of publishers wanting to publish more translations, prizes, even like a kind of standardization around um, uh, you know what translators can charge, visibility of translators' names on cover. So all of those things, I think, that consciousness is definitely changing. So, but I think this what is still lacking a bit is translation between Indian languages, and I think that's something that's being talked about a lot in the world of translation, where English is still the bridge to get to different languages in India. So what happens is things are translated into English and then they get translated into other Indian languages. And that really takes away something very, very essential, because there's so many more similarities in between Indian languages as compared to Indian languages and English, and there's something that gets completely lost. So I think there's some kind of a conversation around facilitating that a little more, and also translating from English into Indian language. I think that's um, it's not as mainstream as, say, the other way around. And I, for some reason, chosen to translate into Hindi, even though like I was mentioning, I'm more comfortable in expressing and writing in English. But I think, yeah, for me, it's a way of building my own vocabulary in my language, and kind of creating more sort of literature in that space. Yeah, as much as possible.
Thank you. And you mentioned then promoting the translation of literary works between Indian languages. I think we must give a shout out at this point to our friends and colleagues at the Center for the Translation of Indian Literatures at Jadavpur University in Kolkata. So Shayantan Dasgupta and his colleagues, who are focusing on precisely that question. Your presentation has set off some very interesting, some comparative thoughts in our audience. We have another anonymous attendee who says, I'm an Arab who speaks and learns Hindi and have thought about doing a comparative literature stroke discourse analysis around this. And then we had a question which I picked up in the chat as well. From an audience member writing as Bond, who says, thank you for the insightful and informative presentation. I'm from China. It seems to me there is also a strong sense of post-colonial shame, not only among common Chinese, but also among many intellectuals, due to many factors. Some scholars propose to retranslate some widely accepted phrases, and some retranslations did take effect from the government side, such as from Tibet to Chinese pinyin. Is there any similar retranslation situation happening in India or Wales? That's an interesting one. Are there retranslation efforts going on that you're aware of?
Just to understand retranslation in the sense of, like, making the like the evolution of the language to kind of include, like, contemporary terms and things like that. Is that the idea of retranslation? I'm just trying to understand. Sorry.
Yes, this is in relation to post-colonial shame. So maybe phrases. So our questioner asks about widely accepted phrases which were affected by post-colonial shame. I don't know whether it's possible to think on the level of a single of individual phrases from your perspective.
Okay, yeah. I mean, what I understand from this is to say that you kind of keep the language as contemporary by actually, like, bringing in, say, current phrases or terms from around the world into the language. This is what I'm sort of understanding, but please tell me if I'm wrong. I think those efforts, I can't speak as much for Wales, but I think in India those efforts are definitely underway, and there are central bodies that come up with these terms and phrases. I don't know how practical they end up being in the sort of everyday in everyday speech or everyday usage. So even though there is an attempt to kind of create and retranslate these terms, I think what happens on the ground is really a kind of hybrid language that emerges. So, I mentioned Hinglish at some point, which is a hybrid of Hindi and English. And in fact, when I was looking at school textbooks now, and when I spent some time in schools in Delhi, I realized that the teachers were telling me that there are some words that have actually become accepted in Hindi. So words like school, words like principal, words like I think even exam, if I'm not wrong. But there are some terms that have become accepted to write in a Hindi exam in school. So the teachers will not mark it as wrong if you write school in Hindi, for instance. So I found that very interesting because, uh, I don't know what to think about it, and there can be many ways of looking at this. But I think those hybrids are emerging much more. But at the same time, officially and in terms like on paper, these efforts are going on. In fact, the new policy talks a lot about like setting up national translation agencies, which will, retranslate all of these terms and things like that across different languages, at least the 22 recognized languages, if not the others, translating curriculum into every language, even higher education curriculum into all of these languages. So there are those efforts officially, but I think what I've seen, happen on the ground is really, a kind of emergence of a hybrid language more than anything, which, is more contemporary.
Thank you. And a further comparative perspective. Now, this is Nailia Shamgunova, who says, more of a comment than a question, although there is a question at the end. Thank you for the fascinating talk. Many of the issues you were talking about, especially shame, are very relevant to the linguistic diversity of Russia, where indigenous languages and languages of colonized people, for example, Tatar, Buryat, Kalmyk, etc., are facing very similar issues. They're not seen as modern or useful. And a situation in which the state, the Russian state, is actively trying to not teach these languages rather than encourage their development. It would be a very interesting comparison to look at the Tatar, Bashkort, etc. textbooks alongside textbooks of local Indian languages. Do you know, this is the question, do you know if anyone is working on that? That's quite a question, but it's a wonderful, wonderful question. Do you know, Mohini, of anyone doing that kind of work?
No, in fact, absolutely not. And if you would like to, then please, if you're interested in this, interested in taking this forward, that would be amazing. I didn't know about this, so thank you so much for sharing this. I think it's really interesting, and I'm sure that many linguistic contexts would be able to, relate to some of these issues. And like I said, I've only picked these two contexts because I am personally familiar with them. But there's so much potential in this sort of strand of research to look at different linguistic contexts, do comparisons, or delve more deeply into a particular one as well. So, thank you for sharing this. I'll make a note and I'll maybe look it up as well, just to have a sense of what's going on there.
Archit has a follow-up question around teaching Hindi literature. The pre-modern Hindi literature is already at the margins of both our popular imagination and school curriculum. However, they are central to Hindi academic discourse. Would marginalizing them further from school curriculum be good for the broader understanding of Hindi literature and culture? UK schools have done a great job in producing digestible versions of Shakespeare. Is it possible to do digestible versions of Tulsidas and Kabir?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Arshad. I think that's a very important point that you've made. And it's absolutely true that it's important to, talk about the evolution of Hindi when we're teaching Hindi at school. I think the issue that I was bringing up was more around, first of all, the age appropriateness of the curriculum. And secondly, also the way that these texts are taught in the classroom. So actually, I did find some very interesting ways in which, I mean, not interesting, but it may also be kind of obvious. But Kabir, for instance, is taught through songs in some classrooms as well. So Kabir, his poetry can be sung. There's a meter in which it can be sung, and some teachers were doing that. But it was really refreshing to see, actually. Oh, sorry, the question disappeared, but it's
Oh,
okay.
okay.
No, no. Um, yeah, no, I think it's More than digestible versions, I think, first of all, placing them at a point where students would be able to access the language, like pre or classical Hindi. Secondly, I think a little more maybe needs to be done in terms of also teacher training, and because when I saw these texts being taught in the classroom, really it was just sort of learning up the meaning, like just learning up the translation of the text, and learning up the answers to the questions at the back of every chapter, as opposed to actually talking about the grammar of the language or engaging with the literature. It was more around, actually, what it was more around the moral of the story, rather than sort of focusing on the poetry or the writer even. So very, very little discussion around the writer, around the context in which it was written, but just more, if Kabir has written a doha or a couplet on, say, um, not treating others badly, then the discussion would be around that, and then students would learn up the meaning of that particular couplet. But that was about it. So I think the issue is with these two things. One is the age appropriateness of the literature that's in the textbook, and the second is the way it's taught. But I think these are really interesting things to think about. So thank you.
We are running out of time, but I wonder if I could perhaps put one last question to you around the theoretical notion of post-colonial shame. Then, as I understand it, there's a sociologists make an important distinction between guilt cultures and shame cultures, and I wonder if you're bringing that distinction into your theorizing around this area, whether perhaps, I don't know, would post-colonial guilt be a kind of internalization of the language shaming? Is that is the shame, or potentially the guilt, similar? Is it a similar situation in Wales as in India? Is that a relevant distinction for your purposes?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Actually, I'm not looking at post-colonial guilt or post-colonial and I'm not comparing post-colonial guilt and shame, but what I am doing is just sort of tracing the like I was talking about how shame is not very theorized in India. I am looking at what is theorized, which is things like humiliation and guilt, and I'm also looking at this sort of complication of the word shame and the translations of it in Indian languages, especially in Hindi. There is a word sharam, but it's not quite like it's very different connotations to shame. So there are some of those issues with just the concept itself,
Mm.
and there's a book by Rita Kothari, who's a professor at Ashoka University. She's one of the sort of most well-known scholars on translation as well. So she has written a book called Uneasy Translation, and I was, she talks about this. She talks about the three kind of ways in which shame can be translated into Hindi. There's lajja, haya, and sharam, and but talks about how they emphasize the doing or maintaining of shame. So it's, or there'll be words like aukat, which is status, or abru, which is honor, maryada, which is dignity. And these terms are invoked when, say, some social boundaries crossed, like gender or caste. So there's some of those connotations that come up when you talk about shame, or the honor of a woman's body, or things like that. So in those contexts, there are some sort of things around it, um but yeah, it's a complex sort of issue. And there is a work on humiliation, like I said, but humiliation is not the same as shame, because humiliation is sometimes seen as a more like an outward thing, whereas shame is a more kind of internal process, and both can sort of lead to each other. So it's a complicated relationship again between humiliation and shame. But I am looking at I'm looking at the like I'm reviewing the literature around these concepts and what already exists, and then sort of applying this concept of shame then to language and the other things that come with it. I hope that makes sense. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, it's and you just opened up a whole nother can of worms, a whole nother set of wonderful perspectives. But we're going to we are now out of time. We're going to need to wrap up. Before we do so, can I just remind our audience that we will have our next BCLT research seminar in a week's time. It begins on Wednesday of next week at 5:15 p.m. in the UK, GMT, and we'll be welcoming Timothy Anderson, who will be giving a research seminar on Teutonic style in 19th century verse translations. And that's also a hybrid seminar. So if you happen to be in the vicinity of UEA in Norwich, then you're welcome to join us in person as well. But that's next week. For now, Mohini, thank you so much, and such stamina as well for the Q&A. I was very aware that you are only just getting over your recent COVID. You would never have known it from the energy levels that you've maintained right through till now. But we must let you go. And Mohini, it's been absolutely fascinating. It's been a real pleasure hearing you introduce your work. Can I thank you on behalf of all our audience? Thank you to our audience as well for your questions and your comments. But above all, thank you, Mohini.
Thank you so much. I've always looked up to the work of BCLT and your work as well. So really, it's a huge privilege for me to be here and share my work with you. And thank you to everyone who attended. The questions were excellent, and I'm going to think about some of them while I'm writing up as well. So really, really helpful as well. Thank you so much.